They called him a prophet, a man of God, a leader sent to save lost souls, but behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Imagine being told that God has chosen you to become a bride. Now, imagine that you're only 8 years old. Tony Alamo didn't just preach about faith. He used it as a weapon to control, to abuse, to destroy. For decades, he built a religious empire, controlling thousands of followers with fear and devotion. He convinced them he was chosen by God himself, that he had divine permission to take many wives, even if they were just little girls. And for years, he got away with it. He stole childhoods, he shattered families, and for years he evaded justice while living like a king in his 15-acre compound. His followers called him a prophet, his victims called him a monster, and when the truth finally came out, it shocked the world. This is the story of the preacher who turned his church into a prison of fear, the cult leader who married children, and the monster who believed he was untouchable. But the real question is, how did he get away with it for so long? Never miss out on our next dark revelation. Subscribe now and stay informed on the stories that matter. Tony Alamo wasn't always a preacher. Before he claimed to be chosen by God, before the world knew his name in scandal, he was just Bernie Lazar Hoffman, a man chasing fame, desperate to be somebody. In the early 1960s, Bernie was just another struggling musician in Los Angeles. He tried to make it in the music industry, branding himself as a promoter and songwriter, but success never came. The glitz and glamour he craved were always just out of reach. But then, something changed. Bernie saw an opportunity, not in music, but in faith. He watched as televangelists captivated audiences, saw how people emptied their pockets for promises of salvation. Religion, he realized, could be the ultimate stage. He abandoned his failed music career and reinvented himself. The struggling promoter became Tony Alamo, a name that sounded powerful, important, like a man with a mission. And what was that mission? According to him, it was direct from God. In 1966, Tony's transformation took another step when he met Edith Opal Horn, a woman just as ambitious, just as eager for influence. She would later change her name to Susan Alamo, and together they created something far bigger than themselves, Tony Alamo Christian Ministries. Their message was simple but extreme. They preached that the world was ruled by evil forces, particularly the Catholic Church, which they blamed for communism, Nazism, and even the world wars. They warned of an impending apocalypse, telling followers that only their ministry could offer salvation. And people believed them. At a time when many were searching for meaning, Tony and Susan provided clear answers. Harsh, terrifying answers, but ones that made people feel chosen. Soon, their ministry began to grow, attracting followers who were willing to leave everything behind to serve God's so-called prophets. But for Tony and Susan, faith was never just about salvation, it was about power. And power, as they were about to prove, could make people do anything. At the height of Tony Alamo's influence, his teachings took a dark and twisted turn. No longer satisfied with controlling every aspect of his followers' lives, he introduced a doctrine that would cement his reign of terror, declaring that polygamy was a divine commandment. He didn't just preach it, he practiced it. Over time, it became evident that his so-called wives were not grown women, but young girls, some barely old enough to read, let alone understand what was happening to them. Alamo convinced his followers that he had a special connection with God, that his authority was absolute, and that questioning him was the same as questioning the Almighty. It wasn't just one or two cases. Multiple girls testified that they were taken as his brides, forced into what he called spiritual marriages. Many were barely in their teens, some were even younger. His stepdaughter, Christiane Cui, bravely came forward years later, revealing in court that she had been raped by him at just 8 years old. One of the most horrifying accounts came from a 9-year-old girl who told FBI investigators that he had sexually assaulted her multiple times. She was not the only one. Alamo's bedroom revealed the sickening extent of his crimes. Investigators discovered that he had intentionally created a space designed to attract and manipulate children. It was stocked with candy bars, a collection of Barbie dolls, and other small trinkets meant to lower a child's guard. His victims were not just physically trapped, but mentally conditioned to believe that whatever he did to them was normal, that it was God's will, that they had no way out. To justify these horrific acts, Alamo twisted religious scripture, writing long letters defending child marriages. He claimed that prophets of old had multiple wives, including young girls, and that this was simply the way of the righteous. His words, carefully crafted to sound spiritual, were nothing more than an elaborate attempt to excuse the inexcusable. Some of the girls were forced to take part in bizarre wedding ceremonies where Alamo presided over his own unholy unions. Their parents, either blinded by devotion or too terrified to resist, handed their daughters over. Those who dared to speak up faced severe consequences: public humiliation, physical punishment, and the ever-present threat of eternal damnation if they left the cult. For years, these crimes were hidden behind the walls of his compounds. The victims remained silent, trapped in a world where escape seemed impossible. But the abuse didn't stop at his so-called marriages. Life within the Alamo compound was built on absolute obedience. There was no room for mistakes, no tolerance for questioning his authority. When someone defied his rules, the punishment was swift and brutal. Beatings were a regular occurrence. One former wife later testified that Alamo broke her nose during one of his violent rages. She was left in pain, without medical attention, expected to continue serving him as if nothing had happened. Children were not spared from his wrath. They were subjected to cruel and unusual punishments for the slightest infractions. Food was withheld for days as a form of discipline, and some were locked away in small dark rooms for extended periods. The physical abuse was relentless, but the psychological torment ran even deeper. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of his rule was the way he controlled families. Parents were forced to give up their children to be raised within the cult's closed-off community. These children were isolated from the world, taught only what Alamo wanted them to believe. They were repeatedly told that leaving would mean losing their souls, that the outside world was wicked and filled with demons waiting to drag them to hell. Some of these children, now adults, have spoken about the sheer terror that kept them compliant. They grew up watching people disappear overnight, their punishments never spoken of again. Fear kept them in line. Even adults who had once been strong-willed individuals found themselves breaking under the weight of Alamo's control. He convinced them that suffering was righteous, that to endure his abuse was to prove their devotion to God. He created an environment where his word was the ultimate law, where questioning him was the greatest sin of all. Despite the growing horrors, his followers remained loyal. Many believed that he was a prophet, that everything he did was part of a greater divine plan. It wasn't until his erratic behavior escalated beyond even their understanding that cracks started to form in the foundation of his ministry. In 1982, Susan Alamo, the woman who had helped build his empire, lost her battle with cancer. Her death should have marked a period of mourning, a moment of transition for the ministry. But Alamo refused to accept that she was gone. Instead of preparing for a burial, he ordered that her body be embalmed and kept inside their home, not for a few days, not for a few weeks, but for months. He gathered his followers and instructed them to pray without ceasing. He claimed that God had revealed to him that Susan would rise from the dead. Her resurrection, he said, would be a miracle that would prove his divine calling once and for all. The faithful obeyed, kneeling beside her lifeless body, whispering prayers as time dragged on. Weeks passed, then months. Susan did not rise. Despite this, Alamo refused to let go of his delusion. The scent of decay began to creep through the house, but still he ordered his followers to believe. Doubt started to grow among them, but they remained silent. Questioning him meant risking everything: punishment, exile, the loss of everything they had ever known. Finally, realizing that he could no longer keep Susan's body in the home, he had a heart-shaped mausoleum built for her remains. But even then he insisted that she would return, that her body was merely waiting for God's command. It was at this moment that even some of his most devoted followers began to realize something was deeply wrong. This was not the behavior of a prophet. This was the desperate clinging of a man whose grip on reality was slipping. For the first time, people began to leave. Some walked away quietly, vanishing into the outside world they had been taught to fear. Others were forcibly removed when they dared to voice their doubts. The cracks had formed. Alamo's ministry, once seen as untouchable, was beginning to unravel. But the horrors were far from over. The man who had built his empire on fear and manipulation was not about to let his world collapse without a fight. And soon, the full weight of his crimes would come to light. For years, Tony Alamo built an empire under the guise of religion. He controlled money, property, and people with an iron grip, ensuring that every dollar and every decision passed through him. But there was one thing even he couldn't outrun: the government. The IRS had been watching. Alamo had spent decades amassing wealth, but not a single cent of it had been reported for taxes. His ministry, despite its claims of being a non-profit religious organization, operated more like a business empire. The followers worked without pay. The money poured in from forced labor, donations, and the sale of ministry-produced goods. None of it was declared. The IRS made their move in the early 90s. In 1994, Alamo was convicted of tax evasion. The evidence was overwhelming: millions of dollars in unpaid taxes, fraudulent claims, and a financial operation designed to hide his growing fortune. The government had enough to put him behind bars, but not for the full extent of his crimes. For now, they could only get him on financial charges. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. For most criminals, this might have been the end. But for Tony Alamo, it was just a setback. He had lost his freedom, but his followers remained loyal. Even from behind bars, he kept his grip on them, sending out letters, issuing commands, and reminding them that this was only a test of faith. When he was released in 1998, he wasted no time rebuilding what he had lost. He re-established his ministry, gathering his most devoted followers and continuing the same operations that had made him a wealthy man before his imprisonment. But this time, the government wasn't the only threat. The victims were speaking out. Some had been children when Alamo ruled their lives. Now they were adults, and they had stories to tell. Stories that law enforcement could no longer ignore. The FBI opened an investigation, piecing together accounts from former members who had escaped his grasp. The accusations weren't just about tax fraud anymore. They were darker, more disturbing. It wasn't just abuse. It was child rape, forced marriages, and a system of control designed to keep victims silent. In 2008, federal agents raided the Alamo Ministries compound in Fuke, Arkansas. Armed officers swarmed the property, breaking down doors, searching every room, every hidden space. They were looking for evidence of child sex abuse, and they found plenty. Inside, they discovered documents that detailed Alamo's illegal marriages to underage girls. His followers had meticulously recorded these so-called spiritual unions, believing they were part of some divine plan. But to the FBI, they were proof of a predator's decades-long reign of terror. Then came the testimonies. One by one, victims came forward. Girls who had once lived in fear now stood before investigators, recounting the horrors they had endured. They spoke of how they were handed over to Alamo by their own parents, of how they were isolated, abused, and told that their suffering was God's will. Some were taken across state lines, transported between compounds in different parts of the country. The evidence was damning. There was no denying it anymore. This wasn't just a case of religious fanaticism. This was organized crime, and it spanned decades. Tony Alamo was arrested. For the first time in his life, he had no control. He was dragged from the home he had once ruled like a king and thrown into a jail cell where his power meant nothing. But the case was far from over. His trial would expose the full horror of what had happened behind the compound's walls. In 2009, Tony Alamo stood in a courtroom facing justice. The trial was grueling, emotional, and undeniable. One after another, his victims testified against him, each account painting a clearer picture of his crimes. Some of them had been just 8 or 9 years old when he took them as his so-called brides. One of them, now an adult, stood before the court and asked, What kind of man of God does what you have done? The answer was clear. Alamo had brainwashed, abused, and destroyed lives. He had hidden behind religion, twisting scripture to serve his desires. He had convinced parents to give away their children, forcing them into a lifetime of suffering. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to issue the sentence. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of every victim, every stolen childhood, every shattered life. Alamo didn't react. He showed no remorse, no regret. To the very end, he insisted that he was innocent, that he was a prophet, that he was being persecuted just as Christ had been. But there would be no resurrection, no divine intervention, no escape. The judge looked him in the eye and said, "One day you will face a higher judge than myself. May God have mercy on your soul." The gavel came down. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison. The cult leader who had ruled through fear was now just another prisoner. For the survivors, it wasn't just a victory. It was justice, long overdue. But even in his absence, the scars he left behind remained. His ministry crumbled. The once thriving compounds, filled with brainwashed followers, were abandoned, left to rot like the memories of the horrors that had taken place within them. Buildings that had once echoed with forced prayers and muffled cries now stood as silent tombstones to a nightmare that lasted far too long. And in 2017, deep within a prison cell, Tony Alamo took his final breath. He died without ever apologizing. No last-minute confessions, no redemption, just silence. For his victims, it wasn't closure. The pain he caused would never fully disappear, but at least they knew one thing for certain. He would never hurt another child again. Tony Alamo claimed to be a messenger of God, but in the end, he was just another wolf in sheep's clothing. And for his victims, justice came far too late. He promised salvation but delivered suffering. Families were torn apart, children were robbed of their innocence, and those who dared to question him were met with violence, exile, or worse. Even after his arrest, the wounds he inflicted did not heal overnight. Survivors were left to rebuild their lives carrying scars, both seen and unseen. Some found the strength to speak out, to fight for justice, and to reclaim their freedom. Others struggled in silence, haunted by the years they could never get back. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, despite the testimonies, there are still those who believe in him. His most loyal followers refuse to see the truth, choosing instead to uphold the illusion he created. They deny the suffering, dismiss the pain, and defend a man who preyed on the very people he claimed to protect. This is the danger of blind faith, when devotion overrides reason, when authority is left unchecked, when people put their trust in the wrong hands. Monsters like Tony Alamo are allowed to thrive. His story is not unique. It is a chilling reminder of the countless others who have used faith as a weapon, who have twisted belief into a tool for power and control. But the voices of his victims will not be silenced. Their stories will not be forgotten. And though justice came too late, it did come. Tony Alamo spent his final years in a prison cell, stripped of the power he once wielded, unable to harm another soul. And in the end, the man who claimed to be untouchable, the man who called himself a prophet, died as nothing more than a criminal. Don't miss out on more stories that expose the truth. Subscribe now and stay informed on the stories that matter.